Welcome, the anointed ones. The most uncomfortable room in the world is not a battlefield. It's a room where people are forced to agree on a lie that's starting to fall apart. That's the kind of room this story begins in. Not loud, not dramatic, no raised voices at first, just a closed-door meeting where everyone walked in thinking they were in control and walked out emotionally undone. Because here's a fact people rarely talk about. Group narratives only survive as long as everyone is willing to lie at the same time. The moment one person hesitates, the entire structure starts leaking truth, and leaks turn into floods very quickly. This wasn't a meeting to celebrate anything. It wasn't strategic, it wasn't victorious. It was damage control disguised as confidence. These were people who had already discussed you countless times before, casually, comfortably, almost recreationally. But this time was different. This time, your name didn't land the way it used to. It sat heavy in the room. It created pauses. It forced eye contact. And nothing exposes insecurity faster than silence filled with second thoughts. What broke them wasn't new information. It was old truth catching up with timing. You didn't collapse like they predicted. You didn't spiral like they hoped. You didn't turn into the version of you that would justify how they treated you. And when people realize their assumptions failed, their confidence usually follows right behind it, often with tears. There's something darkly funny about watching people rehearse certainty and accidentally perform regret. They walked in expecting agreement and walked out confronting guilt, envy, and the awkward realization that they may have underestimated you collectively, which is honestly impressive in the worst way. It takes teamwork to be that wrong. This is the part of the story they never planned for, the moment when your growth becomes undeniable, and their private conversations turn into emotional confessions. Not because you demanded accountability, not because you confronted anyone, but because truth has a habit of entering rooms uninvited and rearranging the furniture. So if you've ever felt like your name carries weight in rooms you're not even present in, stay right here. What fell apart in that meeting wasn't a plan, it was a narrative, and once those collapse, people don't just lose control, they lose sleep. Number 1. The truth looked harmless until it started speaking back to them. At first, they didn't think this conversation would be difficult. They thought it would be routine. Say your name, repeat the old storyline, agree on the same conclusions, and move on. That's how it always went before. But this time, something felt off the moment your name was mentioned. The words didn't flow. The confidence wasn't there. What used to sound convincing suddenly sounded rehearsed. And rehearsed things fall apart when people stop believing their own lines. The truth about you was never explosive. It didn't arrive shouting. It arrived calmly, quietly, and with receipts they weren't prepared to face. The more they talked, the more obvious it became that the version of you they had been circulating no longer matched reality. You didn't fail the way they said you would. You didn't break down. You didn't become bitter or unstable. You simply kept going, and that simple fact made every exaggerated claim, every judgment, every assumption look fragile. Someone tried to soften it by saying, "Maybe we misunderstood them." That sentence alone shifted the entire mood. Because once misunderstanding is admitted, blame has to be reassigned. Suddenly, the truth wasn't attacking them. It was responding to them. It was correcting them. And people don't like being corrected when they've invested time in being wrong. What really hurt wasn't what you said or did. It was what you didn't do. You didn't defend yourself. You didn't explain. You didn't try to convince anyone of anything. You let time do the talking. And time is brutal to lies because it keeps moving while false stories stay frozen. That's when they realized the truth didn't need their permission to exist anymore. The tears didn't come from fear of you. They came from the shock of realizing that the truth they dismissed, minimized and ignored had grown stronger without their approval. It stood on its own. It didn't need a spokesperson. And the worst part for them was this: once truth starts speaking for itself, there's nothing left to argue, only things left to regret. Number 2, they realized. They all misread you in the exact same way. The most shocking moment in that room wasn't raised voices or accusations. It was silence filled with disbelief. They had all been telling the same story about you, confident that their perspective was accurate and confident that their opinions matched reality. But when they compared notes, the contradictions became obvious. Each version of you was slightly different, colored by individual bias, personal fear, or private resentment. And for the first time, they had to admit it. None of them actually knew you. They weren't wrong in small ways. They were wrong about everything that mattered. They tried to reconcile the discrepancies, but the more they spoke, the worse it got. Their attempts to explain away your actions or words sounded weak and flimsy, because they were defending narratives that only existed in their heads. They had built a house of assumptions, and now they were forced to see that it was constructed on empty ground. Every exaggeration, every judgment, every whispered story that they had circulated about you suddenly felt meaningless. They realized they weren't dealing with a person. They were dealing with the reflection of their own insecurities, and that reflection didn't answer to them. The room grew tense as the weight of their misjudgment settled in. Nobody wanted to admit it, but the truth was undeniable. They had spent so much time trying to decode you, trying to predict your reactions, trying to control outcomes, that they completely overlooked the simplest reality. You were never what they expected. You didn't fit their boxes, their labels, or their timelines. You moved according to your own rules, silently proving every assumption they had made to be false. By the time the first tear appeared, it wasn't directed at you. It was directed inward. They were mourning their own blindness, their own arrogance, and the wasted energy spent on misreading someone who had quietly outgrown their understanding. They realized they had underestimated not just your strength, but your clarity, your awareness, and your ability to remain untouchable in the midst of their confusion. That realization left the room raw, exposed, and utterly dismantled, because you didn't misstep. They did. And it was finally impossible for them to ignore. Number 3, the power dynamic they built crumbled the moment your growth was mentioned. They had always operated under the illusion that control was theirs to give and take. In their minds, they had crafted a hierarchy where your place was predictable, manageable, and small enough to fit within their narratives. They spent years fine-tuning this illusion, rehearsing it in whispers and meetings, assuring themselves that the structure was unshakable. But all of that carefully built power evaporated the instant someone dared to speak about your growth. It wasn't a threat in the traditional sense. There were no alarms, no accusations, no confrontations, but that mention alone hit the room like a hammer. They realized too late that your growth was a force they could not contain. They had planned for many outcomes: resentment, confusion, even defiance, but never this quiet, undeniable strength. You had evolved beyond their scripts, beyond their whispers, beyond the boxes they tried to place you in. And as the words circulated, your composure, your wisdom, your resilience, their confidence faltered. The foundation they had built their power on was dependent on you being smaller than you were. Now that foundation was exposed as fragile, as hollow, as entirely dependent on a fiction they could no longer sustain. Every glance across the table carried the weight of unspoken acknowledgement. Each one of them realized that their manipulations, their schemes, their careful plotting to maintain influence over you had failed spectacularly. The room shifted. Old alliances faltered because no one wanted to admit they had underestimated you. The narrative that had kept them comfortable and in control now mocked them in silence, and the cracks in their supposed power were visible to everyone, including themselves. What truly destroyed the hierarchy wasn't your actions, your words, or even your presence. It was your evolution. They were forced to see that while they stayed frozen in jealousy, fear, and pride, you were advancing, growing, and thriving. And in that moment, the illusion of their dominance collapsed completely, leaving them exposed to the truth. The real power was never theirs. It had always been yours. Number 4, they finally saw that their problem was never you. It was their need for you to be weak. For years, they carried a false sense of control, believing the tension, the whispers, and the schemes they created were responses to your behavior. They thought the problem was external, that your choices, your attitude, or your presence were somehow the issue. But when the truth hit the room, it landed like a shockwave. Their problem was never you. Their problem was the version of you they expected to exist, the version that would stumble, doubt, and yield to their manipulation. Their problem was their own dependence on your weakness. The moment someone in that room acknowledged your strength, the atmosphere shifted. You weren't doing anything dramatic. You weren't confronting, demanding, or exposing. You were simply yourself, untouched by the chaos they tried to orchestrate around you. That alone forced them to confront the reality they had been avoiding. They had been constructing their narratives, orchestrating their plans, and justifying their actions based on the hope that you would remain small enough for them to feel secure. And the shock came with a bitter taste. They realized their sense of control, their pride, and their identity were tied to your vulnerability. The realization that you were no longer someone they could manipulate or diminish was like a mirror reflecting everything they had avoided facing about themselves: their envy, their fear, their insecurity. They weren't angry at you. They were mourning the loss of a version of you that had never existed, the version they wanted, the version that would keep them comfortable. Tears, frustration, and stunned silence followed because the room had finally acknowledged the truth. They weren't failing you. You weren't out of line or difficult. Their failure was entirely internal. It had nothing to do with your actions and everything to do with their inability to handle someone who refuses to bend under pressure. They had invested energy, planning, and thought into controlling something that was never theirs to control. And that brutal, undeniable truth broke them, leaving only the stark reality that you had always been untouchable, not because of luck, but because your spirit could never be diminished by their expectations. Number 5, someone in that room felt genuine guilt, and it contaminated everyone else. In every group like this, there's always one person who carries a conscience heavier than the rest. They might try to hide it, to laugh it off, to play along, but it's there, quietly nagging at the edges of every decision. In that room, that person finally broke. They admitted, in the smallest way, that what had been done to you was wrong. That single acknowledgement didn't just land on the air, it spread, like a ripple in water, touching everyone else in the room. Guilt has a peculiar way of moving. It doesn't stay confined to one individual. The moment someone expresses it openly, it forces others to confront their own actions. Suddenly, the stories they had repeated with certainty sounded hollow. The lies they had told themselves to justify their behavior became uncomfortable and impossible to maintain. The person who had first cracked didn't intend to dismantle the entire room, but guilt doesn't need intention to be contagious. It seeps into corners of the mind where pride, arrogance, and denial used to reside. They had entered thinking this was a meeting of strategy, of agreement, of control. By the time the first signs of remorse surfaced, the energy had shifted. Conversations slowed, glances lingered, and the carefully curated facade began to crumble. One by one, the others began to feel it too. the weight of the truths they had ignored, the weight of the harm they had caused, and the unbearable clarity of knowing that someone they underestimated had endured it all without bitterness or vindication. By the end, what had started as a routine discussion became a confessional of emotions they weren't prepared to handle. Tears appeared, not from you, not from fear, not from regret over consequences, but from the raw, unfiltered recognition of their own failure as human beings in that moment. That single spark of guilt had ignited a chain reaction, proving that truth and conscience don't need witnesses. They only need one person willing to acknowledge what everyone else has been avoiding. And in that room, the emotional breakdown wasn't about you. It was about them finally seeing themselves as they truly were. Number 6, they realized you never fought back, because you were busy outgrowing them. The room had been built on a foundation of expectation. They expected retaliation, confrontation, drama, something that would justify all the time, energy, and effort they invested in creating conflict around you. For years, they anticipated that at some point you would react the way they believed anyone like you would. But when they looked at the reality of your life, the reality of who you had become, they saw the truth they could not process. You never fought back because you didn't need to. You weren't absent from the battlefield. You had simply changed the field. You had grown beyond their reach, beyond their influence, and beyond the narrow definitions they tried to pin on you. Your energy wasn't wasted on arguments, accusations, or justification. Every step you took, every boundary you set, and every move you made was a quiet but powerful act of dominance. And dominance in this sense isn't about noise or control. It's about refusing to let anyone else dictate your narrative or slow your progress. That realization hit the room like a cold, heavy truth. The silence that followed was heavier than any accusation. They had been expecting sparks, clashes, and chaos. Instead, they were met with calm, composure, and growth they could neither contain nor explain. Their plans to teach you a lesson or show you your place became irrelevant. The truth they could not swallow was that your strength didn't come from conflict. It came from moving forward without them. By the time someone mentioned it aloud, the room shifted. They were forced to admit that their actions, gossip, and schemes had done nothing to stop you. Every attempt to provoke a reaction had failed, because you were already operating on a level they could not touch. The irony was brutal. They had spent so much energy trying to bring you down, and yet every effort only highlighted your resilience. In that room, the quiet fact of your advancement became louder than any argument they could muster. They weren't crying because they feared you. They were crying because they realized they had been outmatched without even realizing it. Your growth, unannounced and unstoppable, had dismantled every expectation they had about you. Number 7. Their fear isn't about what you know. It's about what you survived without becoming like them. The room wasn't tense because of secrets or intelligence. It wasn't the exposure of facts that rattled them. It was the undeniable truth that you endured everything thrown at you and emerged without bitterness, without malice, without adopting the very tactics they relied on to manipulate and control. That kind of survival is dangerous in the way it reflects on others. They realized their fear wasn't about knowledge or strategy. It was about integrity and resilience they could never match. For years, they assumed everyone responds to cruelty the way they do, by lashing out, scheming, and spreading fear. They believed suffering inevitably breeds bitterness, that anyone who experiences hardship without succumbing is an anomaly. And when someone like you moves through chaos untouched by the same darkness, it disrupts their understanding of the world. It exposes their moral compromises and the limits of their own strength. They weren't afraid of you. They were afraid of what your survival revealed about them. Every comment, every tear, every whispered admission in that room carried the weight of this realization. They saw without anyone having to say it, that your endurance highlighted the contrast between who they are and who you are. Their carefully constructed sense of superiority faltered because they had measured themselves against someone they assumed would fail in ways they expected. Instead, you redefined the measure. Your ability to survive and thrive without stooping to their level was a mirror they didn't want to look into, but couldn't avoid. The irony is brutal. While they relied on manipulation, fear, and aggression to feel powerful, your power came from restraint, clarity, and integrity, and that is terrifying because it's impossible to counter with the same tools. The room felt the imbalance immediately. Their calculations, assumptions, and plans crumbled quietly in the corner of their minds as they realized the simple truth. The problem wasn't what you did, it was that you stayed whole, and they never would. Their tears weren't about you. They were about themselves, confronted by the raw reflection of a strength they lacked, but could not ignore. Number 8. They saw how much energy they wasted. Trying to break someone who didn't break. For years, they invested themselves in the idea that they could control you, manipulate you, or diminish your presence. Every whisper, every scheme, every calculated move was designed to bend you to their expectations or break you entirely. They thought that time, effort, and pressure would eventually give them the satisfaction of seeing you falter. But when the truth hit them, they realized something that stunned them into silence. All that energy, all that plotting, all that coordination, they had wasted it. You didn't break, you didn't stumble, you didn't even pause. What made it worse for them wasn't just your resilience, it was how quietly it happened. You didn't need dramatic comebacks or loud confrontations. You didn't need revenge or retaliation. Every act they took to undermine you, every attempt to manipulate perception, every effort to control outcomes only sharpened your focus, clarified your purpose, and strengthened your character. The irony was brutal. Their attempts to harm you became the tools of your elevation, the fuel of your growth, and they couldn't reconcile that in their minds. The room fell into a strange kind of disbelief. They were forced to confront that their influence had limits, limits they had assumed didn't exist. They had measured power in volume, in fear, in intimidation, and in chaos. What they failed to measure was endurance, clarity, and the quiet resilience of someone who refuses to be defined by others' actions. Every plan to weaken you became proof of their own wasted effort. By the time the emotional weight settled, the atmosphere was heavy with unspoken recognition. They had spent countless hours plotting, coordinating, and justifying, and yet nothing had shifted. You remained untouchable not because they lacked the ability to strike, but because you refused to meet their level. Their tears, their frustration, and their stunned silence weren't about your victories. They were about the realization that all their energy, all their strategies, and all their intentions had been rendered meaningless. You had outlasted them not with noise, but with consistency, strength, and an unshakable presence, leaving them to grapple with the most uncomfortable truth of all. You could not be broken, no matter how hard they tried. Number 9. They weren't prepared to admit you never belonged in their circle to begin with. The most uncomfortable truth in that room didn't come from conflict, confrontation, or argument. It came from the realization that you were never meant to belong there. They had spent so much time trying to force your presence, trying to control your behavior, and trying to dictate your role, that they had convinced themselves you were just another player in their game. But when they finally took a step back and looked honestly at who you are, they saw the stark reality. You were never part of their world in the first place. The weight of that realization hit harder than any insult or accusation could. It wasn't about exclusion. It was about authenticity. You operated on a level of integrity, awareness, and personal power that they couldn't reach, and their attempts to draw you into their circle were never about connection. They were about containment. They wanted to place you where you could be controlled, manipulated, or diminished. That illusion of inclusion shattered the moment they faced the truth. The circle they created was never meant for someone like you, and the reason it unraveled was because you refused to shrink to fit it. Their disbelief quickly turned into frustration, then into shame, and finally into a raw, unfiltered recognition of failure. They had assumed proximity meant dominance, that control meant respect, and that influence meant equality. But proximity doesn't guarantee understanding. Control doesn't guarantee admiration. Influence doesn't guarantee connection. You had always existed outside of their limitations, silently proving that genuine power and respect can't be manufactured or forced. By the time the first tear appeared, the room was quiet. They weren't crying because of anger. They were crying because they finally saw themselves clearly. Their insecurities, their envy, and their attempts to dominate had been visible to everyone, but only now were they forced to confront it. The irony was undeniable. The circle they worked so hard to build had collapsed, not because you wanted it to, but because you had always been too far beyond it to ever belong. And that truth was something no amount of planning, gossip, or scheming could ever change. Number 10. Someone mentioned your name with respect, and it shifted the entire atmosphere. It didn't take much. Just a single voice, careful and deliberate, saying your name with genuine respect, instead of contempt or fear. The room, already fragile from layers of tension, shifted immediately. It was subtle at first, slight pauses, exchanged glances, a change in posture, but everyone felt it. Respect has a way of revealing what lies beneath arrogance, ego, and pretense, and in that moment, the balance of power that they thought they held was upended without a single shout or accusation. They had spent years attempting to define you on their terms, to diminish your presence, to twist perceptions so that your name became a symbol of vulnerability or weakness. But when it was spoken with authenticity, something snapped. The people who were confident in their narrative suddenly realized how hollow it had always been. That one acknowledgement forced them to see you as more than the stories they told each other, more than the assumptions they had built around you. They were confronted with a version of reality they had ignored or refused to see, someone of strength, dignity, and unshakable presence. The shift wasn't just emotional, it was strategic and psychological. Suddenly, all the schemes, all the manipulations, all the coordinated efforts to control perception and narrative felt petty, ineffective, and even absurd. Their own insecurities rose to the surface because the respect given to you exposed the fragility in their own positions. They weren't crying because of fear of you. They were crying because the measure of their own self-worth had been exposed, contrasted starkly against the simple truth that you deserved recognition that they had denied you for so long. By the end, the room was unrecognizable from the one they had entered. The dynamic had shifted silently but irreversibly. Respect doesn't need arguments, logic, or proof. It doesn't negotiate. It simply exists, and when it touches the truth, it dismantles every illusion built to oppose that truth. That mention of your name didn't just change the conversation. It rewrote the entire emotional landscape, leaving them stunned, exposed, and forced to confront the reality they had long avoided. Your presence commands acknowledgement, whether they are ready for it or not. Number 11. They weren't prepared for the reality that you forgave them without needing their apologies. The room carried an expectation, subtle but heavy. They assumed that the person they had wronged would eventually need acknowledgement, confrontation, or some form of validation. They thought forgiveness required them to step forward, to grovel, or to provide the closure they assumed was owed. But the truth they faced shattered that assumption completely. You had forgiven without waiting for apologies, without demanding explanations, without seeking validation. You moved past them on your own terms, and that simple reality left them stunned. They had spent so much time creating narratives that justified their behavior, convincing themselves that the consequences were in your hands, that the reckoning would come when you were ready. They thought they had control over that moment, over your reaction, over the emotional balance of the room. And yet, there it was, your freedom from their judgment, your independence from their guilt. The very thing they expected to demand their attention was gone, replaced by something they could neither understand nor influence. What made it worse for them wasn't just that you forgave, it was that your forgiveness was absolute and unannounced. You didn't need fanfare, confrontation, or recognition. You didn't allow their inability to apologize to control your life. You carried your integrity, your clarity, and your peace into the next phase of your existence, leaving them to face the raw truth of their failures in isolation. Their tears weren't about anger. They were about helplessness, the frustration of realizing that their power over you had evaporated the moment you refused to give it space to exist. In that room, the weight of unacknowledged responsibility became unbearable. Every glance, every pause, every exchange carried the silent, undeniable proof that forgiveness does not require permission. Your grace became a mirror, reflecting not their deeds, but the limitations of their understanding, the emptiness of their assumptions, and the futility of their control. They hadn't lost power over you because of confrontation. They lost it because you simply didn't need to take it. And that reality, so simple and so undeniable, dismantled the emotional architecture they had built for years. Number 12. They finally understood that you didn't lose them. They lost access to you. For years they walked through life assuming that proximity and influence meant control. They believed that every conversation, every plan, every effort to manipulate, gossip, or dictate would secure a place in your world. They treated your presence as a resource, something they could use, bend, or exhaust to their advantage. But the truth they were confronted with in that room was devastating. You hadn't lost anything. They had lost access. It wasn't an action, a confrontation, or a declaration that ended their influence. It was your choice, quiet and deliberate, to step beyond their reach. You didn't need to argue, threaten, or even explain. Every door they thought was open to them had closed, not because you rejected them in anger, but because you had recognized what they could never grasp. Their presence in your life was optional, and their absence didn't diminish you. That realization hit the room with the force of a tidal wave. Their tears, their confusion, their shifting glances came from a place of raw disbelief. They had measured their importance by the access they assumed they had, by the emotional leverage they believed they held, and by the power they thought was theirs. All of it was gone, not through conflict, not through retaliation, but through your silent assertion of boundaries, integrity, and self-respect. You had removed yourself from their narrative without removing them from your consciousness, and that was unbearable. The irony was sharp and inescapable. While they imagined themselves in control, it was you who set the terms. You didn't need to chase them, convince them, or even acknowledge their presence. By existing on your own terms, by honoring your growth, your clarity, and your peace, you quietly demonstrated that access is a privilege, not a right. And in that room, the emotional unraveling was complete. They weren't mourning your absence. They were mourning the loss of a control they never truly had. That understanding, finally realized, left them exposed, powerless, and painfully aware that some people exist beyond the reach of manipulation, forever untouchable to those who once thought they could shape them. Number 13. They couldn't believe how many people secretly admire you now. The room was already heavy with tension, but the moment someone casually mentioned how others spoke of you with respect, the weight became almost unbearable. For years, they had assumed that their narrative about you shaped the way the world saw you. They thought their whispers, criticisms, and manipulations controlled your image. But that one statement shattered their carefully constructed illusion. People admired you. Not out of obligation, not out of fear, not because they were coerced, but because they genuinely respected the way you moved through life, endured hardships, and maintained your integrity. The realization hit harder than any accusation could. They had spent so much time trying to control perception, to ensure that everyone aligned with their version of your story, that the fact you had earned admiration without lifting a finger to force it left them stunned. They couldn't reconcile it with their expectations. They expected resentment, confusion, or doubt to dominate, but instead you had inspired quiet acknowledgement from others who saw things clearly, and that acknowledgement didn't just highlight your strength, it highlighted their failure, their pettiness, and the futility of their schemes. Every glance around the room carried unspoken panic. Their calculations, their alliances, their narratives suddenly felt meaningless. They had underestimated not just your resilience, but your influence, your authenticity, and your ability to garner respect silently without needing to prove yourself. They weren't crying because you were winning. They were crying because the world saw what they could not deny, what they could not manipulate, and what they could not undo. The quiet irony stung sharply. While they believed they were the ones setting the terms, quietly controlling perception and influence, it turned out the world had already decided to see you for who you really are. Their frustration, their tears, and their disbelief were a testament to the invisible power you carried. You had earned admiration without confrontation, without manipulation, without demanding it. And in that room, as the truth settled, they were forced to confront the reality that the respect and recognition you commanded could never be taken away, no matter how hard they tried. Number 14. They realized the conversation wasn't about you. It was about the people they became because of how they treated you. By the time the room fell silent, the most unbearable truth had surfaced. The conversation wasn't about you at all. Every whisper, every accusation, every attempt to justify their behavior had nothing to do with your actions or character. It was about them, the people they had allowed themselves to become in the process of trying to control, manipulate, or diminish you. That realization hit like a thunderclap. They had spent years externalizing blame, projecting faults, and convincing themselves that any fault lay with you. And now they were forced to confront that the fault lay entirely with them. The weight of self-reflection was overwhelming. Each person began to recognize the choices, compromises, and moral lapses that had defined their behavior toward you. They remembered moments they had laughed when they should have acted, lied when they should have been honest, and schemed when they should have shown integrity. Every one of those actions, once justified or ignored, now stood exposed in the stark light of truth. You hadn't needed to confront them. You hadn't needed to argue or accuse. Your consistency, your strength, and your integrity had forced them to look inward, and that reflection was unbearable. The emotional unraveling wasn't about anger or fear of consequences. It was about shame. They were crying, trembling, and stumbling over words not because you had defeated them, but because they were confronted with the person they had allowed themselves to become. In trying to control you, they had compromised themselves. In trying to manipulate your story, they had lost sight of their own. And now, in that room, the illusion of moral high ground dissolved completely. The irony was devastating. They had thought the narrative was about you, but it was never your story that was being written in that room. It was their own downfall. And as the truth settled in, they understood something they couldn't reverse. While you had grown, thrived, and maintained your integrity, they had changed, and not for the better. The conversation ended not with revelations about you, but with a raw, unfiltered reckoning about the people they had become, and the cost of every action they had taken against someone who refused to be diminished. The story of what unfolded in that room is more than just a tale of confrontation or gossip. It's a masterclass in truth, resilience, and the quiet but undeniable power of someone who refuses to be diminished. Every point we've explored, from the moment the truth started speaking for itself to the realization that their narratives had always been fragile, points to the same conclusion. You are untouchable not because of circumstance, but because of who you are. They thought control, manipulation, and projection could define you, but they failed to see that integrity, growth, and resilience operate on an entirely different plane. They invested time, energy, and emotion trying to shape your reality, but in doing so, they only revealed their weaknesses, their insecurities, and the moral compromises they had made along the way. Your strength wasn't loud or theatrical, it was consistent, calm, and absolute. Every scheme they plotted, every judgment they passed, and every expectation they imposed only highlighted your ability to rise above, evolve, and remain true to yourself. They cried, faltered, and finally faced a mirror they weren't ready to look into, the mirror that reflected not you, but the people they had become in their attempts to control you. And the most powerful truth of all? You didn't need to fight, argue, or prove anything. Your growth, your dignity, and your resilience did all the work. The respect you earned, the admiration you inspired, and the influence you hold are not by chance. They are the natural outcome of living in alignment with your truth, even when others tried to drag you into chaos. The room fell apart not because you were defeated, but because you were untouchable, and that was a reality they could not handle. If this story resonates with you, if it inspires you, or if it reminds you of the power that comes from standing in your truth, don't let it stay just with you. Make sure to subscribe to the channel for more powerful insights that lift the veil on what really happens when truth meets deception. Like this video if it hit you in the core, comment below to share your experiences or reflections, and share it with anyone who needs to be reminded of their untouchable power. Stay aligned, stay strong, and remember, those who underestimate you are only highlighting your brilliance. God bless you.